Welcome and welcome back to my kitchen. My name is Alondra and today we are making a classic pie crust recipe. So I'm doing this a little different than I have in the past. I haven't actually weighed anything out yet, but I figured we'll just throw it together and it gives you a better, like, real-time example of how quickly this comes together. So, all-purpose flour, sea salt, cold butter, water, and this recipe also uses vodka. So going with a medium-sized bowl, you can measure by volume. I have a preference. I just like to measure by weight. Starting off, make sure I'm tared out and I'm in grams. So first we're gonna do our 300 grams of flour. That's about 2.5 cups, but $301. You know what? Close enough. So about 300 grams of flour. We have a teaspoon of salt. And that is a teaspoon of salt, and I do also use salted butter. All right, 2 dry ingredients. Flour, salt, we'll give that a quick stir just with a fork. I'll need 2, so I'm gonna pull 2 out for later, but we'll get that salt tossed in. This recipe calls for a full cup of butter, so where I live, that's 2 sticks. I pulled the butter out of the fridge cold, and I'm working kind of quickly. I don't want it to warm up too much, but I'm also not super worried about it because we are gonna let this dough chill in the fridge before we end up putting it in our pie pan. So again, they are kind of like bigger chunks, and that's fine. They're not the final size yet. Kind of coat those little butter chunks so as I'm adding more, they don't just stick to each other. We're going to mix together vodka and water, and then we're going to add ice cubes to this to make sure that it stays really cold. Now, because we're adding ice, that ice will immediately start to melt, which means we may or may not use all the liquid in this bowl. We don't want to make our dough super wet, so I wait to mix the vodka and water until I get to this point just to prevent excess melting of that ice, but we'll probably use the majority of the liquid that is in here, assuming that we're like working quickly enough to use it. So first, I'm going to measure out 3 ounces of vodka. And then 3 ounces of water. And then we'll get some ice, just to keep it cold. Okay. And then let's go ahead, we'll grab a pastry blender and get this mixed together. I'm gonna save that for because I will need it in a second. Save myself the extra dishes. All right, pastry blender. Now I do want chunks of butter in my pie crust. Having those like flakes of butter in between the layers of the flour and salt is what gives us those then like flakes that will separate out and like texturally just be really nice in our finished pie. So I'm using this to cut the butter into smaller pieces, maybe closer to like the size of a pea versus, I don't know, some of them are pretty big, some of them are like the size of a grape. Once we get all of our butter cut into the flour, we'll slowly add in that water and vodka mixture. press it into a disc and then get it in the fridge just to finish hydrating for like 30 minutes. That looks pretty good to me. So you can see we've got still these kind of like bigger chunks, but they're not necessarily bigger than like the size of a pea. And there's variables, so some of them are bigger than others. A lot of it is kind of this like, almost feels like coarse sand or like just barely damp, and then we have these bigger chunks, and that's exactly what I'm going for. If I dump all of this in here right now, we're gonna end up with a clump of wet dough that's like almost soggy in the middle, surrounded by a bunch of dry stuff. I wanna use this to evenly hydrate my flour and my butter mixture. So we've got like a shaggy dough at the end versus like one clump and then a bunch that's dry. So I like to move most of my flour and butter to one side, and I'll add a little bit of this. And then use my forks to kind of mix it in locally. Like just what's right here is what I'm mixing in with the flour and the water. So now that that's absorbed a lot of the water, I'm gonna bring it over, tuck it to the side. Bring in some more flour and butter. Give it some liquid, bring it in, toss that together. So it's less of a stirring motion and more just trying to get that liquid to touch that whole section of flour. And then we're gonna bring it over here, push it to the side. Bring in some more flour and butter. Mix that in. Bring it over here, push it to the side. All right, we got our last little flour butter. Okay. So you can see not everything is super wet. I've still got this section of like kind of dry flour, but these chunks are very sticky, like, or we don't have one clump of really wet dough next to a whole bunch of dry flour, but I've got lots of these like little clumps. So I think this is about perfect. Instead of continuing to stir this, I'm going to use my knuckles to press this down into itself. Give it a toss. Press it down into itself. Give it a toss. So I'm using the act of like pressing to help squish our hydrated dough into those drier bits, but also I'm creating layers of dough by folding and pressing and then allowing it to fold and press over itself. Another reason I'm using the back of my hand is my palm is significantly warmer than the top of my hand, and so by using my knuckles, I'm able to, like, I'm not heating up the butter too much. There we go. So the next thing I need to do is put this in the refrigerator to hydrate for about 30 minutes. Even though we've put liquid on this flour, it just takes a little bit of time for the flour cells or particles to like fully absorb all the moisture out of it. I should also clarify, because I don't think I've said this yet, but this recipe is a double pie crust. So it can be used to make either like a fully enclosed pie, right? Thinking like an apple pie that has crust on the bottom and going over the top, or like a chicken pot pie, crust on the bottom and closing over the top. Regardless of what I'm making, I like to just use the double pie crust recipe because I can always just lop this in half and save half of it in the freezer for the next thing I'm making. We are going into fall right now, so I make significantly more pies this time of year than really any other time of year. So for me, it's a no-brainer. I'm gonna make a double crust. So we have our dough ball. So I will put it in a plastic bag and then press it or roll it out once it's in here, because then it's thinner in the fridge, it will cool down. All right, and then just to give this full time to hydrate, we're gonna pop our prepared pie crust into the refrigerator for 30 minutes, and then from there, we'll make our pies. So our pie crust has been resting in the fridge for about 30 minutes. So we're gonna go ahead and pull that out and then finish preparing it so that it is ready to either store in the freezer for longer term storage or roll out and make into a pie or a quiche or a galette or whatever you plan on using a basic pie crust for. I'm curious to see, because this is my first time filming this process, if it will be obvious the change in texture of the dough since we put it in the fridge. Right, so if you recall, this is a double crust recipe, so I'm gonna go ahead and separate it out into two. So just straight out the get-go, we have what we need to work with today, and the other half we'll set aside. I cut this approximately in half. I am gonna tuck half of this actually back into this Ziploc bag. We'll vent as much of the air out of there as possible. And then I'm just gonna throw this one straight into the freezer so that I have it ready to go for next time. When it comes to baking with a previously frozen pie crust, I like to pull it out of the freezer into the fridge the night before. It's the easiest way, a slow thaw. If you don't have that kind of time, then you can pull it out and throw it on your counter, and in a couple hours it should be at least relatively workable, and it will warm up as you're rolling it out. I suppose it helps if we get a pie dish. Those are pie weights. All right, so I've got my Pyrex. What size is this? This is a 9.5 inch Pyrex pie pan. Today I'm making a pumpkin pie, but obviously this will work for any pie recipe. Because my dough is pretty wet, I am gonna wanna keep the counter pretty generously floured. As I need to, I'll flip this over and then keep flouring. I just don't want it to stick. I don't want the flakes of my pie crust to come apart, and I don't want the pie crust itself to be sticking to the counter or to my rolling pin. Right. Now I'm just kind of using this as like a general guide. Sometimes I need to do a little bit of patchwork once I get my pie crust like into the dish. Now it does have a little bit of spring, like it's kind of expanding and contracting just the tiniest bit, so I am rolling it slightly larger than I need to because it will kind of come back together. So So we'll get this transferred in. Cross over that little gap that was right there. So I'm kind of tucking in this little free edge just to help create, like this has a lot more overhang than it does over here. So I'm kind of turning the top of my pie crust over while dragging it that direction. So I've got like this little spot right here that I think needs a little bit of help. So we'll just kind of transfer over that little extra piece. Boom. Patchwork. I just don't see the point in making an excessively large pie crust to trim it off and have it look perfect when I think this is going to be great as is. Looks so beautiful. Now, that's lovely. Really, it's fine as it is, but I just like to go through and give it a little, just a little something something. Make it a little cute. If you spent any time here on my channel with me, then you know that I like to make good food, but I also really like to make cute things. So if I can add a little bit of flair or something, I'm going to. I am inclined to do so. So the next step in preparing your pie crust to bake would be to place this into the refrigerator or freezer. If you put it in the fridge, you'd probably want it to be in there for at least 30 minutes just to give this butter that's warmed up now a chance to firm back up. A warm dough in a hot oven is going to cause a lot of shrinkage. The edges are going to fall and you'll have less room to hold in your pie filling. If you need to par bake your pie crust for the recipe that you're making, you'll definitely need to chill this in advance. Par baking is a process where you will line the inside of the pie crust with like a parchment paper and then add in something like a pie weight or rice or dried beans that kind of act as like a pseudo filling so that just the crust has time to bake in advance before you add in your filling and finish the baking process. Now, I'm planning on using this today to make pumpkin pie, so I am gonna tuck this into the refrigerator just to help firm up the butter, but I won't be needing to par bake it. And that is a basic pie crust. My name is Alondra, and thank you so much for joining me today for episode 8 in our Back to Basics series while we learn how to make pie crust.